There were flashing lights outside, an ambulance in the driveway, and my father's oxygen machine blinking red. Inside, Karen from the HOA was yelling at a paramedic. He was too loud. I have rights. And then I heard it. The machine had been unplugged. Ma'am, the EMT said flatly, you might have just killed someone. Now, if you're thinking, wait, what? How do you even pull that off legally? And how does she not notice? Trust me, I was thinking the exact same thing. Because 5 minutes before that moment, I was asleep, dead to the world after a night of monitoring my dad's oxygen levels through the smart app on my phone. He's got severe COPD, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, for those unfamiliar with it, which is a fancy way of saying his lungs gave up a long time ago, and we're playing keep him alive on hard mode. And if you think an oxygen concentrator is loud, you've clearly never lived next to Karen's 3 yapping chihuahuas during mating season. But of course, none of that matters to Karen. She's the vice president of our local HOA, which might sound like a part-time gig, but for her, it's a full-blown dictatorship. She treats the community guidelines like scripture and believes enforcement is a divine calling. I moved back in with my dad after he had a fall last year, and ever since then, it's been a war. She once gave me a citation for having a wind chime that made an emotionally disruptive sound. Not kidding. Emotional disruption. Her words. Still, I didn't think even she would stoop to sabotaging literal life support. But then again, this is Karen we're talking about. She complained to the HOA board about the sound my dad's oxygen backup generator made when it kicked on during power outages. Mind you, this was a whisper-quiet, medical-grade unit placed in the side yard, enclosed in noise-reducing insulation. Less noise than her damn sprinklers. But it interrupted her meditation, she claimed. So, naturally, she filed a noise complaint at 3 a.m. Earlier that night there'd been a storm. Not a big one, just enough to make the lights flicker. I checked on my dad, made sure the generator was ready in case of a blackout, then went to bed around midnight. At 2:56 a.m., the power must have flicked off just long enough for the backup generator to hum to life. And that must have been when Karen, in her silk bathrobe of tyranny, decided she had enough. She walked her little power-tripping self across the street, through the gate, and unplugged the generator. Just pulled the plug like it was a noisy toaster. My dad was asleep, and without the oxygen concentrator running, he didn't even have a chance to call for help. He just stopped breathing. I woke up to a weird silence. The app on my phone wasn't connecting to the concentrator. I rushed into his room. He was pale, lips bluish. I couldn't hear the machine. That's when I saw the blinking red light. I panicked, did the only thing I could think to do, called 911, then tried to start CPR. I'm not trained for this, by the way. You never think you'll need it until you're pressing on someone's chest begging them to breathe. The EMTs arrived in under 7 minutes, and that's when Karen made her grand appearance. Arms folded, lips pursed, like she was the one being inconvenienced. She literally stood in the doorway, blocking the gurney, and said, "He was too loud." I didn't know it was medical. One of the paramedics snapped, "You unplugged a medical device during a power outage? Are you out of your mind?" Karen's response? There were no warning signs on it. It just looked like a loud box. Ma'am, it had 3 giant red labels that said, "Medical equipment, do not unplug." She looked at them and shrugged. Those aren't HOA-approved stickers. I wish I were making this up. Now, I wasn't going to escalate. Not at first. I was in full-on survival mode, focused on whether or not my father would even make it through the night. But then the police showed up. The EMTs had called them the moment they realized the machine had been tampered with. That's when Karen started to change her story. First, she said she thought the device was abandoned. Then she claimed she tripped over it and accidentally unplugged it. Then, my personal favorite, she said, maybe it came unplugged on its own. The officer turned to me and asked, "You have cameras?" Of course I did. Karen knew that. She'd even complained about the doorbell cam being aggressively pointed at the street. I showed them the footage. Timestamp. Karen, robe on, slippers shuffling across the lawn, reaching down, unplugging the generator, and then walking away like she just took out the trash. When the officer asked her about it, she said, and I quote, "Well, maybe it was too loud to hear the warning labels. Let that one sink in. They didn't arrest her. Not yet. Said they had to submit everything to the DA for review. But I saw the way the EMT looked at her. Like he wanted to say, what you did isn't just dumb. It's criminal." My dad was stable by morning, but the doctor told me bluntly, another 5 minutes without oxygen, and he'd have suffered brain damage. Or worse. I tried to wrap my head around it. What kind of person hears a low hum and thinks, you know what'll fix this? Sabotage. Who hears a machine working to keep someone alive and thinks their beauty sleep takes priority? Karen, apparently. The worst part? The HOA actually backed her up. They sent me an email the next day accusing me of violating a temporary sound ordinance. Not a fine yet. Just a friendly warning. But the kicker? They attached a PDF with a link to approved medical accommodations, which, get this, didn't even exist the week before. They literally wrote it after the fact to cover her track. That's when I knew. This wasn't an accident. This was deliberate. I sat at the kitchen table, watching my dad sleep with tubes in his nose and bruises on his chest from my crappy CPR, and I realized something. Karen thought this was over. That I'd be scared. That I'd roll over and take the HOA's warning. But she had no idea who she was messing with. And as I opened my laptop and started gathering evidence, emails, footage, incident reports, I heard a familiar hum outside. The generator had kicked back on. Someone was on my property. I grabbed my phone and stepped outside, just in time to see Karen standing at the side gate again. And this time, she wasn't alone. 2 other HOA board members were with her. And they were holding a clipboard. This wasn't over. Not even close. By the time I stepped outside and saw the 3 of them, Karen, clipboard in hand, flanked by 2 other HOA board members who looked like they were auditioning for a suburban mafia, I already knew this wasn't going to be a neighborly visit. Karen gave me that smug little smile that's less, "Hi, how are you?" and more, "I hope you're ready to bend the knee." The man on her left, a guy named Brent with a receding hairline and a tendency to quote bylaws like scripture, cleared his throat and announced, "We're here to formally notify you that your generator installation violates Section 4B of the Exterior Maintenance Code." I just stared at them for a second, genuinely stunned by how bold they were. My father had almost died less than 12 hours ago, and they were standing on my lawn trying to serve me paperwork like I was the problem. Karen didn't even flinch. She handed me a printed-out form with a red stamp at the top that read, "Urgent Notice of Violation." She said, and I swear this is word for word, "This is just a courtesy notice. If the unit is not removed within 48 hours, we will pursue fines and legal escalation." I looked down at the paper. There was no mention of medical necessity, no acknowledgement of the emergency, nothing. Just a lot of vague language about unauthorized modifications and community sound standards. I asked, "You're aware this generator is medical grade, right? It's not just some backyard project." Brent gave me this oily smile and replied, "We understand your concern. But all residents are subject to the same regulations." And that's when it hit me. This wasn't just about noise. This was control. Karen didn't like being challenged, and when I didn't grovel or fold, she decided to flex the full HOA apparatus. The generator was just the excuse. The near-death experience? Inconvenient. And if my father had died? Well, I'm guessing they'd have sent condolences, along with a fine for disturbing the peace. I told them I wasn't removing anything and that the police had already reviewed footage of Karen trespassing and tampering with medical equipment. Karen scoffed, like I'd just told her I believed in Bigfoot. "That's not how the law works," she said. Besides, I didn't know it was medical. It didn't say anything. I reminded her that the unit had 3 medical labels on it, in red, 2 of which she had to literally look past to unplug the cord. Her eyes narrowed. Those aren't regulation stickers. That's when I knew she was nervous. She was doubling down, but her voice had this tight edge to it, like someone trying to bluff their way out of a burning building. I turned to the other board member, a woman named Sandra who had been quiet the whole time. I asked her, "You comfortable backing someone who almost killed a man over a 45 decibel hum?" She looked down. Karen snapped, "Sandra doesn't answer to you." They left a minute later, but not before Karen turned back at the gate and muttered, "This isn't personal. It's just community standards." That phrase stuck with me, community standard. As if nearly killing my father was just a mild procedural hiccup. I went back inside, sat at the dining table, and just breathed for a second. Then I opened my laptop and got to work. First, I forwarded the doorbell footage to my attorney. I didn't have one before this, but after watching Karen lie to the cops, I realized I needed someone who actually understood how to turn her brand of HOA terrorism into a legal firestorm. I found a local lawyer who specialized in HOA abuse cases. Guy named Daniel who had the kind of voice that made even emails sound like closing arguments. He responded within the hour. "If that video is as clear as you say, this isn't just a civil issue. This is criminal." While he reviewed the footage and drafted a complaint, I went deeper. I started pulling every email I'd ever received from the HOA. Every passive-aggressive note, every absurd citation, every neighborhood-wide bulletin where Karen warned about visual disharmony and seasonal yard infractions. It was like assembling a portfolio of suburban insanity. But what really sent me over the edge was discovering that the HOA had modified their rules just 2 days before the incident, quietly adding a clause about unauthorized emergency equipment. They hadn't informed any of the residents. No vote. No discussion. Just a stealth update. And who authored the change? Karen herself. I knew that because one of the neighbors, bless her, sent me a screenshot of the private HOA group chat that Karen accidentally included her in. It showed Karen bragging about getting rid of the noise menace before it spreads. Noise menace. That's what she called my father's medical generator. Armed with that, I gave everything to Daniel. His next email was short. This just became a lot bigger. "We're pursuing both criminal charges and a civil suit." I asked him if it was possible to include the HOA itself in the suit. He said yes, if we could prove they acted with negligence or complicity, which based on the backdated rule change and Karen's role in it, was very likely. Meanwhile, my dad was still in the hospital. He'd stabilized, but his lungs had taken a hit. The doctor told me plainly that if the power had been cut for even 10 more minutes, we wouldn't be having this conversation. I visited him that night and sat by his bed, holding his hand while he slept, trying not to think about how close it had been. And I made a decision. We weren't just going to stop Karen. We were going to dismantle the entire rotten structure she'd built around herself. The next day, I filed a formal complaint with the police department, attaching all the footage, email correspondence, HOA documents, and the group chat screenshot. I also contacted the local news. Didn't give my name, just said there was a story about an HOA official who unplugged a man's oxygen machine because it was too loud. That was all it took. By the end of the day, 3 different reporters had reached out. Karen must have caught wind of it because that night a brand new letter arrived at my doorstep. This one wasn't from the HOA. It was from a lawyer. Her lawyer. A cease and desist, accusing me of defamation and demanding I cease spreading false and damaging rumors. I almost laughed. She was worried about her reputation now? She tried to kill a man and was worried about gossip. I forwarded the letter to Daniel, who replied, "Cute. I'll handle it." But what really sealed it for me was what happened 2 days later. I got a knock on the door. It was Sandra, the quiet board member from before. She looked pale and jittery and had a manila envelope in her hands. "I can't be part of this anymore," she said. She handed me the envelope and left without another word. Inside were internal HOA memos, Karen's correspondence. One of them, dated the day before the incident, said, "If he won't move that generator, we'll make it happen. Rules are rules." That was it. The smoking gun. Karen had planned this. It wasn't just pettiness. It was calculated. And now I had the proof. The local news picked it up within 48 hours. I knew they would. All it took was one anonymous tip and the headline practically wrote itself. HOA official accused of disabling man's oxygen machine over noise complaint. They ran it with a freeze frame from the doorbell footage. Karen in her robe, hand on the plug, eyes locked on the camera like she thought it was daring her. I watched it air from my dad's hospital room, sitting beside him while he drifted in and out of a medicated sleep. The nurse turned the volume up when she saw the headline, then looked at me, wide-eyed. "That's her?" I nodded. "Yep. That's the woman who thinks my dad's life was worth less than her silence." The internet did what it does best. The story blew up. Within 12 hours, it had gone viral on Reddit, Twitter, Facebook groups, even a subreddit dedicated entirely to HOA horror stories. Comment sections were full of people who'd had their own run-ins with power-tripping Karens in positions of neighborhood authority. Some of them lived just a few towns over and shared screenshots of Karen's aggressive HOA posts from community forums, posts that aged about as well as unrefrigerated shrimp. My personal favorite was a thread titled "Queen Karen of HOA Hell," where someone pasted her old quote, "I consider myself a steward of suburban peace." Underneath it, someone replied, "She stewards peace like a sledgehammer stewards a glass vase." Karen, predictably, did not take this well. The first sign of her unraveling came through a poorly written Facebook post where she blamed the media, the HOA board, and, somehow, me for manipulating public perception. She insisted she was being unfairly villainized and claimed she acted in accordance with HOA policy. It backfired. Hundreds of comments tore her apart. One person asked, "What HOA policy involves tampering with medical equipment?" Another said, "If you were following the rules, why are you the only one lawyering up?" It was the kind of public reckoning usually reserved for minor celebrities who get caught shoplifting or screaming at waiters. Back at the neighborhood level, things were imploding faster than anyone expected. Sandra, the board member who had given me the damning memos, formally resigned from the HOA and posted a statement on the community message board. She said she had lost faith in the integrity of the leadership, and that recent events had made it clear the HOA no longer served the interests of its residents. She didn't name Karen directly, but she didn't need to. Everyone knew. That night, 3 more members followed her lead, leaving Karen as the last standing officer of a rapidly collapsing regime. At this point, the district attorney was involved. My lawyer, Daniel, had made sure all the footage, emails, memos, and medical documentation were submitted in a formal complaint. When he told me the DA's office was taking it seriously, I asked what that actually meant. He said, "It means she's not just looking at a fine or a slap on the wrist. We're talking criminal negligence, possibly attempted manslaughter." I repeated the last 2 words out loud, trying to let them sink in. It felt surreal. Karen, who once threatened to fine me for a mismatched mailbox color, was now staring down felony charges. Meanwhile, Karen started unraveling in real time. She showed up at a neighborhood meeting unannounced and tried to explain herself. She brought charts, actual printed charts. One of them was labeled Community Decibel Map. She pointed to my property and said, "As you can see, this house has become a disruptive force in the community." Someone from the back shouted, "Lady, you nearly killed a man." Karen's face twitched, but she pushed on, trying to recast herself as the victim of a smear campaign. The room wasn't having it. By the end of her speech, someone threw a foam gnome at her, and she stormed out in tears. I'd love to say I felt bad for her, but that would be a lie. Watching her empire of petty control crumble was cathartic. Every smug citation, every unnecessary rule, every stupid complaint about the color of someone's porch lights, it was all catching up to her. The poetic justice was almost too perfect, especially when a few of the more tech-savvy neighbors dug up her own HOA violations from years ago. Turns out Karen had installed a non-compliant gazebo without approval and had never paid the fine. Hypocrisy meets spotlight. As pressure mounted, Karen's lawyer tried to negotiate. We received a letter offering to settle any outstanding civil grievances in exchange for a full non-disclosure agreement and mutual ceasefire. Daniel laughed when he read it. "They think this is about money," he said. "They think you'll sell your silence for a check?" I told him, "I'm not interested in a payout. I want accountability." That was the moment I knew this had stopped being about revenge and become something bigger. This was about making sure people like Karen don't get to hide behind clipboards and bylaws while putting others at risk. The hearing date was set. Karen was formally charged with criminal negligence causing bodily harm and unlawful interference with medical equipment. Her mugshot hit the news cycle faster than you could say, suburban downfall. She wore the same robe from the doorbell footage, as if she wanted to complete the aesthetic. At the preliminary hearing, her lawyer tried to argue that she had no way of knowing the machine was life support. The judge asked, "And the red labels that said medical, do not unplug?" The lawyer stammered. Karen looked like she wanted to sink into the floor. Then came the twist I wasn't expecting. During the discovery process, Daniel uncovered internal emails between Karen and a local real estate developer. Apparently, there had been a long-term plan to push out elderly residents under the guise of neighborhood revitalization. Karen had been angling to raise HOA fees, issue targeted citations, and enforce noise complaints as a way to make life unbearable for those who didn't align with the future vision. My father, a sick retiree on oxygen, had been squarely in her crosshairs. It wasn't just about noise. It was targeted cruelty. That changed everything. The charges were upgraded. Intent was now on the table. Karen, who had once micromanaged trash can placement, was now being scrutinized by a courtroom full of people ready to watch her fall. As I sat outside the courthouse on the bench, waiting for the next session to begin, a neighbor approached me quietly. He was an older guy, had lived in the neighborhood since the 90s. He patted my shoulder and said, "About time someone stood up to her. We all saw it. We just didn't think she'd go this far." I nodded. Neither did I. But she did. And now she's going to pay for it. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with quiet tension as the judge called for recess. Karen's expression had shifted from smugness to something much more human. Fear. Real, undeniable fear. She looked around, maybe hoping for someone to back her up. But there was no one left. Her board had abandoned her. Her reputation was ash. And the man she almost killed was alive, breathing, and ready to testify. And we hadn't even gotten to trial yet. The courtroom was packed on the day of the trial. Not with media, though a couple reporters did linger by the steps, but with neighbors. People from all corners of our little HOA-infested community came to watch the show. Some brought coffee. One guy even brought a folding chair like it was a backyard barbecue. The general mood hovered somewhere between outrage and popcorn-worthy anticipation. Karen walked in wearing a muted gray suit that looked 2 sizes too big for her and carried the expression of someone who had finally realized they weren't the hero of the story. The prosecutor didn't waste time. They laid out the timeline with brutal precision. The footage of Karen unplugging the generator was displayed frame by frame, projected on a screen that seemed far too large for the quiet courtroom. The audio was crystal clear. Her slippers shuffled across the concrete. Her hand reached down. The click of the unplugged cord echoed through the speakers like a gunshot. Then silence. That terrible silence. The prosecutor turned to the jury and said, "This isn't a question of whether she did it. It's a question of whether she thought her comfort mattered more than a man's life." Karen's defense team stumbled out of the gate. They argued intent. They tried painting her as a community advocate, overwhelmed by the stress of her volunteer role. They described her actions as a lapse in judgment and an unfortunate misunderstanding. At one point, her lawyer actually said, "My client did not act maliciously. She was simply unaware of the device's medical nature." The prosecutor countered by pulling out a printed photo of the generator. 3 giant red warning stickers, all reading "Medical equipment, do not unplug." The courtroom fell so quiet you could hear someone in the back whisper, "Yikes." Then came my testimony. I wasn't nervous, not really. I was angry, focused. When they asked me to describe the night of the incident, I didn't spare details. I told them about the flashing red light, the way my father's chest didn't rise, the panic of trying CPR with shaking hands. I told them about Karen standing there, arms crossed, watching EMTs work on the man she'd left for dead. I told them how she had the audacity to say, "He was too loud." When I finished, I looked at her. Her face was pale, tight. No smug smile this time. But it was the EMT's testimony that really sealed it. He was calm, professional, and devastating. He told the court how every minute without oxygen exponentially increases the risk of brain damage and death. He confirmed that Karen's actions delayed life-saving care. He even described how she tried to argue with him while they worked. She kept saying it was just a noise complaint, he told the judge. Like that justified anything. There was a long pause after that, the kind that makes everyone sit a little straighter. The weight of it settled in the room like fog. By the end of the week, the jury was done. They deliberated for less than 2 hours. The verdict came swift and sharp. Guilty on all counts. Criminal negligence. Unlawful tampering with medical equipment. Reckless endangerment. Karen didn't cry when the verdict was read, which surprised me. She just sat there, like a mannequin deflating slowly from the inside out. The judge sentenced her to 18 months of house arrest, a hefty fine, and mandatory community service, including volunteer work at a medical facility. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The woman who couldn't stand the sound of a generator would now be surrounded by the beeping of medical machines every day. But the story didn't end there. The fallout back home was just beginning. With Karen gone and the HOA in disarray, the remaining residents held an emergency vote. Nearly everyone showed up. People who hadn't been to a meeting in years were suddenly engaged. It took 2 hours and one extremely satisfying round of public complaints, but the decision was unanimous. The HOA was to be dissolved. Permanently. The bylaws were shredded. The rules revoked. Freedom, in all its messy, unregulated glory, returned to the neighborhood. Someone brought cupcakes. I'm not kidding. It felt like a birthday party. Mine, specifically. Karen's house, once the pristine model of regulation perfection, fell into disrepair within weeks. No one checked on her. Her mailbox overflowed. Her lawn grew wild. A few neighborhood kids started calling it the haunted house, because she never came outside during daylight. One neighbor told me they saw her peeking through the blinds every morning like she was afraid the HOA would come back. Ironic, really. She'd spent years terrorizing others through rule enforcement, and now she was imprisoned by her own paranoia. No one sent her cards. No one brought her groceries. Silence, her favorite thing, became her curse. As for my dad, he got better. Slowly, stubbornly, in the way only old men with unfinished business do. He came home 3 weeks after the trial and settled back into his recliner like it had been saving his spot. We installed a new oxygen system, solar-powered, off-grid, completely HOA-proof. I caught him watching reruns one afternoon with the window open, generator humming softly outside. "Still too loud?" he asked me, smirking. I laughed and said, "Perfect volume." We let the wind chimes sing that evening. No complaints, just the sound of peace finally earned. A few months later, I got a letter. Certified mail. It was from a state regulatory office. Apparently, Karen's conviction triggered a review of her actions not just at the local level, but with the wider homeowners association network. Turns out, she had been lobbying for similar HOA expansions across several nearby communities, pushing for stricter codes, higher fines, less oversight. That was all under review now. Her conviction set a precedent, and several of her proposals were being walked back. I guess she had no idea how far her own consequences would travel. The best part? A neighbor started a wind chime exchange program. Totally real. People began gifting each other handmade chimes as a kind of inside joke and middle finger to tyranny. Karen had tried to silence everything she didn't like. Instead, she became the symbol of what happens when someone abuses power in a community that finally decides to push back. One day, about 6 months after the trial, I walked past her house. The windows were still shuttered. The paint had started to peel. On the fence someone had written, in chalk, "Rules are for safety, not for power." It was gone by the next rain, but it stayed with me. This whole thing started because someone decided that her comfort was more important than someone else's life. That's the kind of thinking that festers quietly, undetected, until it finally gets dragged into the light. And when it does, people notice. They wake up. They vote. They write letters. They testify. They win. And me? I still live here. Still with Dad. Still watching those wind chimes dance in the breeze. I kept the generator running just a little louder than necessary, like a soft warning bell. Not obnoxious, not aggressive. Just loud enough to remind anyone listening that some sounds are worth protecting. And if anyone has a problem with it, well, there's no HOA left to stop me.